space race between superpowers in the last century, particularly the Soviet Union and the United States, was no different from a real arms race. And in any race, there will inevitably be winners and losers. The winner will affirm their position on the international stage, while the loser is forced to retreat in silence. However, the truth is that whether winning or losing, both sides suffered losses. No smell of gunpowder, no tanks, no submarines, but real blood was shed. Victory in this race was truly pivotal. Perhaps that is why the United States turned its pioneering Apollo 1 mission into one of the worst aviation disasters. They turned astronauts into living torches burning brightly in space. Naturally, while the public rushed to praise the great space achievements of both the US and the Soviet Union, the aviation disasters were concealed by the governments of both countries. Was it just a fatal miscalculation, or the stubbornness of an overly ambitious government determined to win? Welcome back to the primitive universe. Apollo 1, the tragic end of the pioneering mission into space. One of the events that awakened Americans in the space race occurred on October 4, 1957. S first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, into Earth. Americans were stunned that the Soviet Union soared so early. Moreover, on April 12, 1961, this man launched the Vostok 1 into space. That first human flight into space, lasting 108 minutes, became a painful blow, striking hard at American pride. They were no longer just stunned, now they were afraid. From then on, a series of programs to send humans into space and to the moon were urgently implemented by the US government. Do you recognize this man? He was one of the men welcomed by all America in the late 60s of the last century. Armstrong, Aldrin, or Collins all returned from the moon as great heroes. They had surpassed the Soviet Union. This scene was no different from Captain America appearing in real life. However, to exchange for these moments of glory, America had to sacrifice many things. And one of them was the worst space disaster in human history. In the early 60s of the last century, the United States officially entered the race with the Soviet Union in a mission to explore space. To win, American researchers built a giant rocket capable of sending 3 astronauts to the moon. That was Apollo 1. NASA also sent astronauts deep underground to train for long-duration missions on the International Space Station. The United States needed to conduct many tests to ensure its trump card performed to its maximum potential. But unfortunately, no launch went according to plan. The giant rocket could not reach lunar orbit. Meanwhile, the Apollo spacecraft continued to be improved in new directions. NASA envisioned the Apollo module facing downward to land directly on the moon. This design of the Apollo module could also be used for ocean landings. All worst-case scenarios were pre-calculated. The Apollo module was already equipped with an escape system similar to its predecessor. In an emergency, the sensor system would activate as planned. The rocket would pull the spacecraft away from the launch pad before exploding. This system had been tested earlier in 1966. The Little Joe rocket carrying the Apollo module completed its role as calculated by researchers just 26 seconds after takeoff. This proved that in a real emergency, this system would work perfectly. Test technology was on par with the Soviet Union. As long as the race to the moon wasn't over, no one would certainly give up. Astronauts returning from space were welcomed like stage stars. They were praised by the public as heroes, and that was what Americans expected. In February 1966, the T-1B rocket, a launch vehicle commissioned by NASA, for the Apollo program was ready for an unmanned test flight. If everything went smoothly, the United States could significantly shorten the time for space exploration. All tests were aimed at improving the efficiency of the Apollo 1 spacecraft. The debris fell into the ocean just 37 minutes after the booster rocket left the launch pad. Its mission has been successful, although during the testing process, it encountered engine difficulties and problems with the electrical wiring system, leading to a loss of control over data, but those were extremely valuable experiences. It seems everything is ready for the United States' first manned flight into space. According to NASA's plan, Gus Grissom, one of the first astronauts of the Mercury program, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, and Roger Chaffee. The flight into space will be carried out in February 1967 with the Apollo 1 spacecraft. Grissom made significant contributions to the development of the. Therefore, he was entrusted by the government and the research group with the task of commanding this voyage. But Grissom seemed to have unusual feelings of anxiety. I am concerned about the extent of the changes made in the command module and the compatible simulation devices. Does the flammable material in the compartment also increase significantly? While human technology advances every day, the complexity of Apollo 1 has caused its completion to fall behind schedule. NASA discovered many shortcomings in the ship's development process. Since its establishment, NASA has always published its research for the world to follow. This contrasts with how the Soviet Union carried out its space programs. Therefore, the mission of sending humans to conquer the moon for the first time, carried out by the United States, was widely reported by the media. This makes the astronauts even more stressed. You know, excessive expectations are the heavy pressure that leads to failure. As the Apollo 1 launch day approached, the astronauts directly participated in simulation test activities. All tests at the Cape Canaveral base are aimed at evaluating the effectiveness of the Apollo spacecraft. During many hours of testing on January 27, 1967, the simulation counter ran continuously to prepare for the greatest moment of the 20th century. At 1300 on the same day, the crew, after putting on their full gear, entered the Apollo 1 command module. This compartment is designed to fit exactly 3 seats, making astronauts feel cramped when seated. The cabin is fully equipped with a ground communication system and a UC system. 3 minutes after the countdown, the startup process begins. All compartment doors are sealed, and the internal air is replaced. All cabin doors are sealed. The internal air is replaced with pure oxygen at 16.7 psi, 2 psi higher than atmospheric pressure. When trying to contact the ground command station, the microphone system malfunctioned. How can we land on the moon if we can? At 5:40 p.m. on the same day, the Apollo 1 launch rehearsal was resumed after the technical team fixed the microphone issue. At that time, the test countdown proceeded smoothly until 6:30 p.m., when the crew completed the final check before leaving the module. 9 hours later, the command station suddenly heard a desperate cry from an astronaut. Fire, there. Next is the noise from the other side. There. Toot, toot, toot. All that could be heard were the agonizing screams from the Apollo 1 crew, leaving the communicators distraught. What's going on? Immediately, the rescue team ran to the ship's command compartment. They hope everything is still under control. However, it was all too late. Pure oxygen made the flame burn faster and more intensely than ever before. High temperatures, thick smoke, the ship's door blowing hot, and poorly functioning air masks. All obstacles hindered the rescue efforts of those outside the command compartment. In an environment containing pure oxygen like Apollo 1, everything burned down, including the astronauts. I wonder how desperate they were when they were burned in the cramped space of Apollo 1. The astronauts, carrying the hopes of the entire nation, burned up like living torches before the eyes of the entire research team. Apollo 1 and its entire crew did not make great history on February 21, 1967 as planned. Unfortunately, they etched their names as one of the most tragic pages in the history of American space exploration. Apollo 1 perished just before embarking on its mission to land on the moon. The 1967 Apollo 1 accident remains a lingering pain in the memories of those involved in the Apollo program during the 1960s. Throughout the over 4 decades of the bloodless war, many American and Soviet space talents silently sacrificed so that later glories could shine. It seems that under pressure from leadership, NASA was too hasty with its space programs. Then, while the Soviets were still celebrating the monumental event of April 12, 1961, with the space legend Yuri Gagarin, the US not only failed to reap any sweet fruits, but also had to endure the pain of Apollo 1. The ground crew desperately tried every means to get them out, despite the risk of the command module exploding. When the pure oxygen in the cabin was nearly depleted, the flames gradually died down, and inside, it was filled with a high concentration of. It took 5 minutes to open the command module's hatch. The scene before those present that day became an extremely haunting traumatic memory. All 3 talented astronauts of Apollo 1 had no signs of life left. Even worse, the cruel flames had burned them beyond recognition, making it impossible to tell who was who. The 3 bodies were charred black, with spacesuits fused to the remains of their bodies. The day after the devastating Apollo 1 fire occurred, the NASA director urgently requested the then US President, Lyndon B. Johnson, to allow the agency to secretly investigate the cause of the incident and promised to report the entire truth before informing the public. On April 5, 1967, NASA submitted the report on the cause of the Apollo 1 incident to the President. The forensic autopsy determined that the main cause of death for all 3 astronauts was cardiac arrest due to high levels of CO2. The varying degrees of burns on the crew were not the primary cause of their deaths. The burns were all determined to occur after the 3 astronauts had already perished. Regarding the cause of the fire, NASA reported: first, the ignition source might be related to Apollo 1's electrical wiring system, or possibly due to pipes carrying flammable and corrosive coolant on the spacecraft. Second, the oxygen level in the cabin was much higher than atmospheric pressure. Third, the sealed command module was not easy to open or close, making emergency escape procedures difficult and Fourth, there were too many flammable materials in the command cabin. Fifth, the rescue efforts inside and outside the cabin were insufficient and ineffective. It seems that researchers overlooked danger warnings under government pressure, leading to a terrible disaster. Because in reality, this incident seemed to have been warned about 2 years prior. That is the story of the near disaster of the Gemini mission. Following the Mercury project, America's first effort to send astronauts into space, the Gemini project was designed to test and perfect all necessary procedures and capabilities for the upcoming Apollo moon program, including long-duration spaceflight, orbital rendezvous, orbital maneuvers, and extravehicular activities. While astronauts had significantly contributed to the design of the earlier Mercury capsule, the Gemini spacecraft was entirely a different matter. Customized according to the specific preferences of the pilots, the cabin layout, controls, and instrument panels were modeled after a high-performance fighter jet. Mercury 7 astronaut, former Air Force test pilot Gus Grissom, was one of the 3 influential astronauts in the design of the Gemini spacecraft who perished. Another fighter jet-like feature of the Gemini spacecraft was the launch escape system, LESS, designed to bring the crew to safety in emergencies during countdown or launch. The LESS on the earlier Mercury spacecraft consisted of a solid fuel rocket motor mounted on a tower above the capsule. In an emergency, it would ignite and propel the capsule, along with the crew inside, safely away from the launch vehicle. In contrast, the Gemini spacecraft was equipped with ejection seats like a fighter jet, and these very devices caused the tragic deaths in the Gemini crew. The Gemini mission aimed to test 2 of the most critical capabilities needed for the upcoming Apollo missions: orbital rendezvous and docking. NASA had chosen the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous (LOR) method for landing on the moon, which involved using a spacecraft called the Lunar Excursion Module (LEM), which would detach from the Command Service Module (CSM), land on the moon, then take off again and dock with the command module in lunar orbit. Ensuring astronauts could perform these procedures reliably and safely was crucial to the success of the entire Apollo program. To achieve this goal, the Gemini 6 mission would have its crew approach and dock with an unmanned target vehicle. Agena. This vehicle was launched into orbit ahead of them. Selected for the mission were command pilot Walter Schirra and pilot Thomas Stafford, both members of the Mercury 7 astronaut group. Schirra had previously orbited the Earth in the Sigma 7 mission on October 3, 1962. He was the fifth American and the ninth person in the world to fly into space. In contrast, Stafford was a rookie selected by NASA in 1962. At 9:45 a.m. on October 25, 1965, Schirra and Stafford took the elevator to the top of Launch Complex LC-19 at Cape Canaveral and were strapped into their seats in the spacecraft. 15 minutes later, the Agena target vehicle, mounted on the upper stage of an Atlas rocket, roared away from nearby Launch Complex LC-14. But while the first stage of the Atlas rocket performed perfectly, immediately after separation, a hole in the engine of the second stage caused the Agena to explode at an altitude of 240 kilometers. 50 minutes later, when the target vehicle was just a cloud of debris falling into the Atlantic Ocean, the Gemini 6 spacecraft was still on the ground, and astronauts Schirra and Stafford were removed from the craft. After this incident, NASA planners did everything they could to salvage the Gemini 6 mission. Since the new Agena target vehicle could not be prepared in time, NASA proposed an alternative plan. The new mission, designated Gemini 6A, would rendezvous with the Gemini 7 spacecraft, which was scheduled for launch in early December. Gemini 7 was successfully launched on December 4, 1965. 8 days later, the two astronauts were back on the launch pad for the second launch attempt of Gemini 6. At first, everything went according to plan. The flight checks proceeded smoothly. The countdown proceeded to 0 without any issues, and the engines ignited right on schedule. But just 1.5 seconds after ignition, the engines suddenly shut down, and the Titan II booster of Gemini 6A settled back on. And instead, Commander Wally Schirra faced a critical decision. All rockets are essentially giant balloons. The Titan II rocket was particularly dangerous because it was powered by a volatile combination of hydrazine hydrate and nitrogen tetroxide. These fuels are hyperholic propellants, meaning they ignite upon contact with each other. If the Titan II fell back onto the pad, the fuel tanks could rupture and the propellants mix, creating a giant fireball. Therefore, the rules of the launch complex stipulated that, in the event of an engine failure at liftoff, Commander Schirra must immediately pull the ejection lever to launch himself and his colleague Stafford away from the potentially. But Schirra did not do so. Aware of the rules, Schirra hesitated to follow them. Although he heard the engines ignite, he did not feel the rocket lifting off. So when the engines stopped, Schirra quickly reasoned that he and Stafford were not in danger and decided not to eject from the spacecraft. An hour later, the launch pad crew safely secured the malfunctioning rocket, and the two astronauts climbed out of the spacecraft. Their mission was once again aborted. It was Schirra's quick reasoning and calmness under urgent pressure that likely saved their lives, as well as those of his crewmates. Tom Stafford explained in a 1997 interview. What we would have seen, if we had ejected, would have been two human torches, because we were at 15 or 16 psi. Immersed in pure oxygen for an hour and a half. My God, with that flame, it would have burned the suit. Everything was soaked in oxygen. So, thank God, NASA never tested that. They did conduct some tests at China Lake, where there was a Gemini capsule mock-up. But what they did was fill it with nitrogen gas. They did not fill it with oxygen during the test. And even if the astronaut suits did not catch fire, the 20 jolt required to eject them 250 meters from the spacecraft, the minimum safe distance to escape the fireball, would likely have caused serious injuries. However, if Schirra had felt any movement at that time, he would have pulled the ejection lever because, as he later said, it was a choice between certain death or ejection. The engine shutdown was attributed to a premature disconnection of a control cable, and the Titan II rocket was quickly returned to flight ready. On December 15, 1965, Schirra and Stafford once again boarded the Gemini 6A spacecraft for the third launch attempt. This time, everything went according to plan. The Titan II rocket lifted off from the launch pad at 4 hours later, Gemini 6A successfully approached Gemini 7, performing the first manned spacecraft orbital rendezvous in history. Over the next 5 hours, the two crews performed orbital maneuvers and flew in formation. Subsequently, after a long rest period, Gemini 6A left the formation and began its return to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean at 15:28 on December 26, 26 hours after liftoff. The Gemini 7 astronauts found the 2-week mission monotonous. While the space was spacious at the beginning, the waste storage area became cramped, making conditions inside the cabin nearly unbearable. Nevertheless, the mission was successful, proving that astronauts could survive and operate in space for extended periods. The next attempt to dock with an Agena target vehicle occurred on March 16, 1966, with the launch of Gemini 8, commanded by Neil Armstrong and David Scott. However, this mission also nearly ended in disaster, as shortly after docking with the Agena, a thruster became stuck, causing the spacecraft to spin uncontrollably. Only through Armstrong's quick actions did the crew escape being incapacitated or killed by the rapidly increasing G-forces. The following mission, Gemini 9, also encountered similar problems. As with Gemini 6, the Agena target vehicle failed to launch, forcing the initial plan to be cancelled. However, NASA had planned for this contingency, and 2 weeks later, they launched an augmented target docking adapter, a simpler backup docking target based on the Gemini capsule's design. 2 days later, Gemini 9A was launched into orbit. Unfortunately, during the launch, the pilot discovered that the launch shroud had not separated, making docking impossible. The first successful docking of Gemini with an Agena occurred 4 months later, on July 19, 1966, during the Gemini 10 mission, commanded by John Young and piloted by Michael Collins. From then on, NASA quickly made up for lost time. By the time Gemini 12 returned to Earth on November 15, 1966, the Gemini program had achieved all its objectives, and NASA was ready to move on to the Apollo program, aiming to land humans on the Moon for the first time. That this program could proceed so rapidly without a fatal accident was largely due to the quick thinking and excellent piloting skills of astronauts like Wally Schirra and Neil Armstrong. However, Commander Schirra's wise decision with Gemini 6A only postponed the inevitable. The tragic deaths of the Apollo 1 astronauts in February 1967, which once again exposed the dangers of using pure oxygen in spacecraft. Reports still claim that, up to that point, NASA was completely unaware of these dangers, but that is not the case. Several fatal accidents involving fires in high-pressure oxygen test chambers had occurred before Apollo 1, including 2 at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio and the Naval Aircrew Equipment Laboratory in Philadelphia in 1965. And on February 16, 1965, just 10 months before the Gemini 6A launch, 2 Navy divers died when a fire broke out in their decompression chamber at the Experimental Diving Unit in Washington. So why did NASA continue to use a pure oxygen environment in their spacecraft? First, pure oxygen is breathable at much lower pressures than regular air, meaning cabin pressure can be kept lower and the spacecraft structure would be lighter. Second, breathing a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere carries the risk of decompression sickness, also known as the bends. Finally, maintaining a mixed gas atmosphere requires additional tanks, scrubbing systems, and other equipment. All of these add weight and complexity to the spacecraft. Therefore, NASA assessed the pure oxygen environment as the lighter, simpler, and safer option. However, after the Apollo 1 fire, engineers were forced to reevaluate that decision and ultimately reached a compromise. In all subsequent Apollo missions, a nitrogen-oxygen gas mixture would be used during launch but replaced with pure oxygen after the spacecraft reached orbit. Most flammable materials that caused the Apollo 1 fire, such as Velcro and nylon, were also removed from the spacecraft and replaced with more fire-resistant alternatives. The potentially deadly launch door system on the spacecraft was replaced on Apollo with an escape launch system mounted on the tower above. The only time NASA used rocket launch seats for spacecraft was during the first two shuttle missions in 1981, later removed due to the spacecraft's design. At that time, the cabin atmosphere also shifted to an oxygen-nitrogen mixture more similar to Earth's atmosphere. Thanks to these measures, NASA did not experience any other spacecraft fires and hopes never to have one again. Apollo missions after the tragic event of Apollo 1 on January 27, 1967, changed completely. 18 months after the accident that killed 3 American astronauts, NASA resumed its mission to send humans to the moon and succeeded. On July 20, 1969, 2 years after the death of the Apollo 1 crew, Americans successfully landed on the moon. They officially became the pioneering nation in the race to Earth's natural satellite, temporarily surpassing the Soviet Union in the multi-billion-dollar lunar expedition. Back in the mid-1960s, a former NASA astronaut admitted that the leadership's goal of landing on the moon within 10 years was an overly ambitious aspiration. Perhaps the tragedy of Apollo 1 could have ended all American efforts to reach the moon if the US had not been caught up in the massive space race with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It seems that political calculations and the ambition to outdo the Soviet Union pressured the US to push NASA into undertaking one of its most ambitious and difficult missions in history. In reality, Apollo 1 was not an improved version of the Gemini spacecraft. It was a completely new spacecraft and, despite about 5 years of development, was not ready to fly by January 1967. When urgency overrode safety issues combined with political maneuvering, disaster was understandable. This lesson was perhaps most deeply felt by NASA itself. From a humanitarian perspective, the sacrifice of 3 American space talents on Apollo 1 before they could take off into space somewhat helped NASA gain experience for safer future flights. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. This leap was so immense that humanity has yet to fully accept this truth. There are still many theories suggesting that everything NASA announced was merely a product of Photoshop or editing. To honor the contributions of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts, Americans solemnly placed the remains of Commander Gus Grissom and pilot Roger Chaffee at Arlington National Cemetery. Astronaut Ed White was buried at West Point Cemetery on the grounds of the U.S. Military Academy in West Point, New York. History forever records the great contributions of these space heroes. Thanks to them, not only Americans but all of humanity made significant strides in space exploration. If the Soviets opened the dawn to space exploration with the event of sending the first human into Earth's orbit in 1961, then the Americans achieved resounding success with the Apollo moon landing program, the first in human history in 1969. The gunpowder-free race between the two superpowers, though it produced many sacrifices and losses, clearly helped humanity move closer to the dream of flying out, even working in space. The glory of victories on the space front between the US and the Soviet Union truly made public opinion extremely joyful. And now, here esteemed journalists, Viek and will meet you again in new exploration videos on the Primitive Universe channel. Subscribe to the Dark Truth Files channel to watch the latest videos.